Welcome everyone to this webinar. It's great to have you here with us. The webinar is organized by the Center for Autism and Theology, formerly the Center for the Study of Autism and Christian Community. Before I introduce our speaker today, Stewart Rapley, let me briefly introduce the center to you. So the Center for Autism and Theology was founded in 2018 by my colleague, Professor Grant McCaskill, and a couple of other colleagues here in the Department of Divinity and Religious Studies at the University of Aberdeen. So the center aims to host interdisciplinary research into autism in relation to theology, church, and faith. And as such, we hope that the center becomes a hub that brings together all those interested in this intersection of autism and theology. So we hope that this will be at the service of the church and other faith communities. As part of our activities, we organize 2 webinars per teaching term, so that's for a year. And do take a look at our website to see more details of what we are doing in terms of research projects, how you can get involved. And as of last week, we have a Facebook page, so there you can follow us as well. So our speaker for today, Stewart Rapley. Stewart is on the Board of Trustees of the National Autistic Society, and we are very grateful that he also serves on the advisory group for our Center of Theology and Autism, or Autism and Theology. Stewart will talk to us about some of the ideas that he has recently written down in his book that was published only last month, Autistic Thinking in the Life of the Church. Some of you who have been following us for a little while know that the previous webinar was on sensory processing. That was with Dr. Katie Unwin. And today we are switching gears a little bit, or not gears, but topic, with Stewart, who is going to focus more on the cognitive aspect of autism, especially in relation to faith and church. So he is going to present his ideas in about 30 to 40 minutes. Then we have a short break, 2-3 minutes, just for you to pause, to reflect, and start typing your questions in the chat box. And after that, we have a Q&A session of about, well, half an hour, more or less. So with that, Stewart, a very, very warm welcome to you. I'm really excited that you're here with us. And we look forward to what you have to say. The digital floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Liam. I'm delighted to be here and to be associated with the Centre for Autism and Theology. And let me then just put this webinar in context personally for you. I was diagnosed in 2006 as being on the autistic spectrum myself. The language in those days was Asperger's syndrome. We wouldn't use that term now. In 2018-19, after I retired, I went to Theological College, and in my dissertation, I got to look at all of the questions that have been kind of going around in my head for many years about the way that I thought and how it affected my faith. Out of that has come the book that Leon's kindly mentioned, Autistic Thinking in the Life of the Church, an article in the Practical Theology Journal just been published, which is just a kind of extract from the dissertation. And then I'm involved in a pilot exercise to set up a community based on the ideas in the book with a church based here in Manchester, but operating nationally across the UK. So this webinar today is based on the ideas in my recent book. So what I'm trying to do today then is to get across the point that engagement between the church and autistic worshippers is not just about how do we in the church get this message and this understanding into the heads of these people who are autistic, but has the autistic person got something to offer that might even challenge or reframe or enhance the Christian understanding in the church? So what I'm going to do then is look at some starting points in terms of understanding autism. So I have no idea where you're all coming from on that. So just to kind of get us onto the same grid. Secondly, I'll talk briefly about two types of brain. I'll then move into the theological challenge, where I'll outline, and it will only be an outline of a few thoughts and directions in which we can develop our thinking. I will look then at autistic thinking and the ways in which that has implications for us in terms of our faith. And very briefly at the end, I'll talk about some of the mitigation strategies that I observed from people that I did my research with, and some pointers for improving dialogue between the church and the autistic worshippers. So first of all then, some starting points on autism. So as Leon has mentioned, I'm involved with the National Autistic Society in the UK, and our assessment is that about 1%, although I think that estimate is going up at the moment, 1% of the UK population, we think, are directly affected by autism. If you then include family, friends, carers and so on, then clearly that figure is going to escalate. And so very quickly then you can get to a situation with even just a modest congregation in the church where you've got at least one such person to consider. Now we talk about an autistic spectrum these days, and some of the people who are autistic, you will very easily identify them as autistic because there are certain behavior characteristics maybe that you are looking for, but there might be some who don't look autistic at all. So that's often said to me, and in certain circumstances then I've learned to cope and to function, move slightly to the left into a different place, so coffee after church as opposed to in the service, and oops, everything falls apart. So when I'm talking about autism here, I'm talking about the way a person thinks and the way in which they process their sensory information. So this is all about information processing. That, of course, is then overlaid with all kinds of life experiences, things we've learned and so on and so forth. Some people who are autistic have learning difficulties, others do not. And so the person that you meet may or may not appear autistic. And I like to think that people who are autistic will experience church in a way that impacts in three areas. First of all, the obvious ones socially, so coffee after church, being asked to share the peace with strangers and so on and so forth. The sensory aspect, being in a large building, lots of people, coloured windows, lights, noise, music and so on, and the whole sensory overload potential that has. And then thirdly, the cognitive side, particularly in the Western Christian tradition, we use a lot of text. So the Bible, obviously, but then creeds, liturgies, hymns, songs, and even those churches which are informal in that they don't use creeds and liturgies very explicitly, often have a very clear routine to the way their service goes. And so in this webinar, I'm going to focus, as Leon's pointed out already, on the cognitive aspects. So two types of brain then. And for this, I'm very thankful for the writing of a researcher called Peter Vermeulen, who wrote a number of books, but one in 2001 called Autistic Thinking, This is the Title, in which he compares autistic people with computers. Obviously, analogies have limits, but in the sense that they have difficulty integrating details and assigning meaning on the basis of a coherent context. So if you hang on to that idea about processing information, assigning meaning, and in a context, then you'll see how that fits together in a moment. So Autism then as Context Blindness was a second book a bit later on, 2012, where he notes the trend in research, particularly going into the space around neurology and the focus on neurology, where he says recent research in areas such as neurology, psychology, philosophy, and artificial intelligence has shown that context plays a central role in the way the human brain processes information. Using context might be a challenge for the autistic mind. I call this context blindness. So good reading if you're interested in the subject. So then, my two types of brain. First of all, neurotypical. So people who are not autistic, how do they process information? So there's a brain, and the neurotypical brain functions in a way that has what I call a relational bias. And by that, I mean that it processes information, assigns meaning in a way that is in the context of relating to people. I'm very fortunate to be endorsed by the wonderful Simon Baron-Cohen, who published a book in 2020. So it was after I'd done my dissertation, but he is a leading researcher in these areas at Cambridge University and has written a book recently called The Pattern Seekers. And he talks about brains, a type of brain that has an empathy quotient. So that's his equivalent. I'm interested in two things. The brain is doing lots of things, obviously, but two functions here. First of all, filtering data, and secondly, inferring meaning. And of course, these are happening at the same time and interactively. The first one then, filtering data. And your brain is working to sort out what's irrelevant, what's in the background. So here you are listening to me, watching me. You can perhaps see out of a window in the corner of your eye, there's trees, birds flying by, perhaps cars going up and down the road or whatever. And your brain, you're sort of seeing it, it's going in there, but your brain is going, no, that's in the background, don't need that. Focus on what Stewart's saying and so on. And so you've got that foreground there. And what the brain then is also doing is bringing to the party stuff which is not there at all. So it's bringing out from context and previous experience and memory, expectations that you have, interpretations of what you're seeing in terms of body language or facial expression or tone of voice that you're hearing. And also it's putting in things about omissions, things he's not saying. Well, that tells you a lot. As well as the actual words. And so a very rich picture there. So some of it is going in the filing cabinet. Yes, it's in the brain, but we don't need it. So let's just kind of put it in there, subconscious, whatever. The rest of it now I'm using to contextualize some sort of meaning out of what I'm experiencing. So that's the neurotypical brain. Contrast that with the autistic brain and how that processes information, and that has what I've called a systemic bias. And again, I'm pleased to be able to say that Simon Baron-Cohen talks in his book about a brain with a systemizing quotient. And the filtering process here is not working, or at least not as well. I'm presenting these things as polarized just to get the concepts clear. And so all of the sensory information is just coming, as it were, flat, and it's not really sorted out into foreground and background, it's just experience. So you can see very quickly why sensory overload can be a problem, but also you can see why some people who have an amazing recall ability, the ability to actually get hold of that data, can actually repeat all kinds of amazing facts that they just happen to have absorbed. The rest of us absorb all of that information, but it's not there for us to use. So the second thing then, inferring meaning. And so the way the autistic brain is working is it uses the actual words, but it doesn't do anything with any of the rest of it. So no contextualization, expectations, reading body language, tone of voice, things that are not said, and so on and so forth. So all of those things then are left floating in the brain. Now, clearly, one sees body language, one hears tone of voice, but the brain doesn't actually make any meaning out of that, doesn't interpret it. And so you get a meaning based on the actual words, and the rest experienced largely as noise. And that can be experienced either in terms of some sort of mild sense of anxiety, and obviously if that can escalate and so on to a full meltdown situation. So that's the way the two different brains work, and you can see very quickly then how, for example, in a social context, which is very rich in multiple sources of information, where an autistic brain that is just functioning on the actual words, which is 7%, so it's said, of any communication, plus the requirement socially to decide what you're going to say and respond and interject and so on, that becomes hugely complex, and therefore one is likely to make mistakes, say things that are inappropriate or whatever. So you can see how some of the classic autistic behaviors start to work on the basis of this model. So let's just switch gears slightly then, put that thought to one side and start to think about the theological challenge that we have with autism. Now, I'm sure autistic people have always existed, but autism as a thing was only named in the middle of the 20th century, and so it's fairly recent in that sense. And we can't just look in the Bible, therefore, to find any direct information about autism. And neither is it particularly helpful to speculate as to whether key biblical figures, I've suggested Nicodemus here, or whatever, are autistic. Somebody in a seminar just last week said to me, this is not a biblical figure as such, but do you think Francis of Assisi might have been autistic? Well, the people who are writing in the scriptures weren't using these sort of categories. They weren't aware of, what we mean by autistic, and so they're not trying to convey any of that. And secondly, I'm not quite sure what it tells you. I mean, it might be a bit of fun, I suppose, but to decide that Jeremiah is autistic or whatever, what does that do for you? So I think we need to think more then in terms of how do we develop a broad theological understanding of humanity, a space then within which we can accommodate and frame autism. In my experience and research on this, the most common starting point was the whole notion of humankind being created in the image of God, the Imago Dei. And as you all know, the passages in Genesis 1 and so on and so forth refer to that. And so that's where most of the literature started. Now, just outside of the straight theological space, there are a number of models of disability within which you can start to develop an understanding of autism. Now, just set aside for a moment the question as to whether autism is a disability or not, contested question, but just bear with me for a moment. Theologian Deborah Beth Creamer identifies 4 models, sort of summarizes them into 4 types. So first of all, there's the moral model, which she says tends to operate in the religious context, and that assigns usually a moral value to a disability or an impairment, usually negative. So hence you remember the question to Jesus, was it this man or his parents who sinned that resulted in him being born blind? And so there's an implied ideal person here, and so potentially that raises then the question about healing, about repentance, forgiveness, or even exorcism. Secondly, there's the medical model coming, as you would expect, out of the medical fraternity, and it operates in very much the same sort of way, that bodies are seen as machines. The disability is some sort of defect in the machine, so there's again that implied sense of an ideal person with a defect, And so question, does that need to be fixed, cured, or even screened out genetically before birth? The social model turns the thing on its head and says, well, it's not actually the person who is disabled. They are disabled by virtue of the way society functions. So if I'm in a wheelchair and there's no lift in a block of flats, how can I get to the 5th floor? I can't. If there is a lift, I can. So in the one case, I'm disabled. In the other case, I'm not so. So here the ideal person is replaced by the ideal society. So how do we fix society and so on to mitigate the disability? And then the fourth type is what Creamer calls the limits model. And that simply says, look, everybody's got limits. The disability simply locates those limits in a different place. And that's helpful in that it dissolves the whole kind of barrier between disabled versus normal and the categorization of some implied ideal state. So they all have something to say, but they also have difficulties. So note the ideal person problem in the moral medical model. The social model is fine in one way, but it then tends to deny that there's any difficulty with a person or any difference or distinction, and just points the finger at society. And also, of course, doesn't work if you're not in a social context. If you're in a wheelchair and you're in the woods, you still can't climb a tree. And the limits model, it seems to me, just flattens everything. So fine, it takes away all the distinctions and so on, but it's not quite clear what it leaves you with. And so it's very validating, but becomes rather empty in terms of telling you anything further. So then, let's pick up again on the idea of humans made in the image of God. So we can see cadences of that in the moral model. So could it be that it's actually the imago Dei itself that is the problem here? And the implication then of ideal human being has a number of consequences. So first one is what makes a person? Are there some humans that don't qualify? Well, you would think that isn't a question that we would ask these days. Well, T.J. Mawson, in his book Belief in God, defines what it is to be a person in such a way that he focuses on rational qualities, and he then argues that God is the most perfect person possible, and goes on to say that there are categories of human being that don't qualify. But then he seeks to excuse himself, as it were, on the basis, look, don't worry, folks, because there are plenty of things in life, your dog, for example, which are not persons, but which you treat well and you treat kindly and so on. So don't worry about it. But the implications of going down that slippery slope, I think, are fairly obvious. If the image of God then implies conformity to an ideal model of humanity, is it God or is it me who needs to change? Well, theologian Nancy Iceland goes down the route of saying that why don't we imagine God to be disabled? Think, for example, of the crucified and the resurrected Christ. Still the wounds of the cross there in the resurrected Christ. So God, in a sense, disfigured and disabled. So then we say, I'm made in the image of God, and so that, as it were, expands that category, and I'm included. Now that sounds very attractive, but it seems to me a perfectly circular argument that I just, as it were, imagine God to be disabled, a bit like me, and then I say, well, I'm made in the image of God, and that makes everything okay. So that's just, for me, that's just a circular argument. So how do we then get to a theological space within which to understand autism? So I'm going to quote our own Grant McGaskill here. He takes the following approach in his book, Autism and the Church, where he argues that Jesus Christ is the only human being who is fully in God's image, and that we participate in God's image rather than individually being made in God's image. We participate in that image by virtue of our union in and relationship with Christ. Now, the benefits of McCaskill's approach are, first of all, that it locates our identity and nature firmly in the context of our union with Christ, which is good. Secondly, and I have no basis on which to challenge this or anything, I just assume he's right about this, it provides a faithful understanding of the Genesis text in the original language. Thirdly, it provides for the inclusion of autistic and many other people purely on the basis that they are organically part of the body of Christ. They were given to the body of Christ. So we don't need to be included. We're already part of the body of Christ. And it avoids the notion of defects fixing that we've talked about as a precondition for belonging. But then you've got the implication of the Spirit making us like Christ, so the full God-filled version of ourselves. But I think it is important, though, to think a little bit in this context about the whole idea of sanctification. So you'll be familiar with the kind of verses that talk about us being made more and more like Christ and so on and so forth. I'm not going to read them out. You will have come across most, if not all of them. So is God's Spirit then making us literally like Christ? Only an autistic person would ask that question, of course, but so no, I don't think so. I'm not necessarily supposed to be the same height or have the same hair color or eye color. Or is it about being the best version of me that I can be? And so John has Jesus saying, I came that they may have life and have it to the full in John 10:10. So I've mapped out one or two areas for thought there. It's hardly comprehensive, and there's more in my book. But let's turn to some of the implications then of thinking as an autistic person. So we're picking up those two models. And I did some research so this is qualitative research. I talked to 9 autistic Christians around the country, all committed to their churches. And these are some of the themes that came out. So first of all, we talked about concept of God, thinking about God, and the way in which the church talks about and presents God, and the way in which congregations typically think about God is very much around a person. So we talk about persons of the Trinity. There was some functional MRI scan research done that indicated that neurotypical people, when they talked about God and prayed, activated areas of their brains that had to do with relating to other people. And so that whole idea that God is, as it were, another person, a being. The autistic people, those parts of the brain didn't light up, or not so much. And what I found was people generally had some difficulty with this concept and tended to prefer to think of God in non-anthropomorphic terms, so not as a person, but perhaps more as a force, a spirit, or something like the source of all being. If you think then of God as a person, it makes sense to think of prayer perhaps as talking to God, having a conversation with God and a relationship with God, and so on. If, as many autistic people may do, you think that's a bit odd, then the idea of prayer as talking to God doesn't make any sense. And so the theme started to emerge then of thinking about prayer as simply being with or in God rather than talking to God. When it came to the Bible itself, then now we've already talked about the tendency for autistic people to take things at face value, to take what is said, take it literally, and so on. The people that I were talking to had a fair degree of self-awareness and self-knowledge. And so what they were able to articulate was, when I come to the Bible, I know I'm just going to take it literally. And that's not great. Okay, it works sometimes, but it's not a great approach generally. So I am very much in need of explicit help in terms of interpretation and contextualizing what it says in the Bible. But I see my neurotypical friends as being much more confident to interpret the Bible in their own context, because they bring out of their brains, as it were, all kinds of other information to make it make sense. Now, there are risks and dangers in doing that, of course. They can bring all kinds of 21st century assumptions to bear and so on. But I remember talking to my wife about a verse in Luke, Luke 6, where Jesus says, give to everybody who asks of you. And so as a student, I tried that and it didn't work at all well. We all just ended up in trouble. The person I tried to help was in prison. I was in front of the bank manager having overspent all my money, and in 1974, not so easy to borrow money. And so, you know, my wife's immediate response is, well, it obviously doesn't mean that. And it depends what you mean by give. And so these two words, obviously and depend. And so that's what comes out time and time again in the neurotypical context. And then finally, supporting texts, so creeds, liturgies, hymns, songs, and so on and so forth. And there are two functions that these perform, really. The first one is what I call community reinforcement. So isn't it great that we're saying these words together, singing these words together with all the people here today, in other churches around the country and around the world today, and in history and going into the future. So that's one aspect. The second aspect then is much more about truth. What is this saying? And in times gone past, when people couldn't read, then that was a very useful way to reinforce beliefs, reinforce what people believe. And so the autistic people found themselves very much analysing the words. Does this make any sense? And so on, and saw their neurotypical counterparts in the congregation being much more interested in the community side of it. You know, isn't this nice to say this together and be together and so on. And just one or 2 points to note there. I've just already made the point about how much use we make of texts. So some autistic worshippers are able to adopt the neurotypical language, and I had to sort of probe and penetrate that a little bit in my research, because particularly those who'd grown up in the church used all of the language, but it didn't necessarily make any sense. And of course, at one level, we all know the language is just the language anyway, that it's not reality. And I'm just to re-emphasize the point again, I'm doing this very much as an either or. In reality, it's not quite so polarized often. But here is a slide then that summarizes and maps out the conclusions that came out of that research. And I'm not going to go line by line down this, but just very visually to say that in each of those areas, you can see the left and right axis, the churches were perceived, and this is perceptions of the autistic Christians, might have got a different view if you talk to church leaders or whatever, or neurotypical people. So these Christians perceived the churches as being broadly central, but with a leaning to the right-hand side, the relational side. So, and they saw their congregations as, again, broadly fitting where the church is, but leaning even further to the right, to the more relational side. And they saw themselves as being over to the left-hand side. And so much smaller overlap with where the church is. So a much bigger area of risk. So they're at the edge or even beyond the edge of where the church is. And in most cases, at quite some distance, a big gap to where the congregation is. So they had a number of strategies for mitigating the risk here. And the risk is basically cognitive dissonance. I go to this service and I hear all this stuff and it just doesn't make any sense, does my head in. And that can be either mild, so cognitive dissonance, not necessarily a bad thing. If it's mild, picture on the wall, not straight, get up, straighten picture, sit down. So it can prompt us into action, helpful. If it keeps escalating and you can't do anything about it, that's when it becomes distressing, painful, meltdown. And my research suggested that autistic Christians employed a range of measures to dissipate and mitigate this. First of all, selective attendance. So just being careful what they went to, what you don't. Well, doesn't everybody do that? Well, yes, sort of. But one person, for example, told me, I'm very unlikely to go to a service at Christmas because it's so busy and so noisy. That's a bit sad, don't you think? Secondly, personal reading. So reading their own stuff. Well, we're all encouraged to read for ourselves, of course, yes, but we're usually encouraged to read in order to supplement and add on to what the church is telling us, not as an antidote to, as a counter to, because what the church is telling us doesn't make any sense, which is often where these folks were. Thirdly, attending more than one church. Go with the family to one perhaps and somewhere else to get your own personal support, and then be very careful about what you take on as a volunteer, what service you take on, perhaps a bit more behind the scenes. So just some ideas there. And then very briefly, here are some things that they suggested might help that the church could do. First of all, there was a widespread view that it'd be great to have more understanding and training and so on amongst the leadership in the congregation of what autism is, and just a broader awareness. Secondly, perhaps a go-to person who could cope with the odd questions and understand why they trouble autistic people. So yes, we all have problems with taking the Bible literally, but why is it that this keeps me awake at night and my wife just goes, yeah, right, fine, and moves on? Thirdly, to provide some basic help and skills with interpretation of Bible, whether that's in a group or the home group or whatever it is. And then fourthly, some advice and guidance to preachers, just to be aware of the risk of people taking things too literally. So I've given you an example there. I can give you many more. I was asked this to amplify on this just last week in a seminar. I had a very good example from a service I've been to the week before. Number 5, then, explicit permission, just the church leader standing at the front and saying, look, you know, if you choose to kind of not come to some things and come to others, we're not going to interpret that as a lack of commitment, which it often can be. So just making that space available. So there we go. That brings to a close what I have to say. Liam, let me hand back to you at this point.
Stewart, thank you very, very much. That was wonderful and really a lot to think about. And yeah, I think we better take a 2-minute break for us all to let us sink in, think about what Stewart has been saying, start to think about some questions that you might have or some comments for Stewart. The way it works is that you can type your questions or your comments in the chat box. Hannah in the background will sort them out and I will try to moderate the discussion. Let's hope that goes well. If you want to, I just want to stress that this webinar is recorded. It will be published on YouTube and on our center's website. If you want to remain anonymous, that is perfectly possible. When you post your question or your comment, there is a tick box, I believe, which allows you to post it anonymously. If you don't tick that box, your name will appear. I will try not to mention your name, but I cannot promise. So if you want to remain anonymous for the recording, then you're absolutely welcome to do so by ticking that box. So Stewart, thank you so much again. Let's take a 2-minute break and then we'll have about half an hour Q&A, unless there are so many questions that we need a little bit more time, but we will finish by 5:30 latest.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right.
All right, I think it's time to resume. There is already a number of questions in the chat box. You're welcome to keep typing your questions, your comments in the chat box. And again, just let me emphasize for the purpose of recording that if you want to remain anonymous, you can do so by ticking the box when posting your comment or your question. So the first question that I have here, Stewart, for you is, how do you think we can re-engage with autistic young people who have already been put off by church because of all the ways that they have been isolated and marginalized by the means that you've mentioned in your presentation? Okay,
can you hear me okay? I can't see the questions, yes. By the way. I've got live event Q&A up, but I've not got anything in it. It's just going around with a little thing going around in a circle, but that's okay. Yeah, well, that's a brilliant question, isn't it? I deliberately, in my research, picked out a group of adult autistic people who had a long-standing commitment with their church. And the reason for that is because one can imagine all kinds of other groups of people who've got disillusioned, who are thinking of leaving their church or have left their church and so on. And then, of course, you corrupt the whole thing with all kinds of different attitudes and concerns and so on and so forth. So I think, and I've spoken to some, that there will be a lot of people out there, adults and children, who have, as it were, either bounced off the church or who have been involved and who have left because they've not been understood or they've been badly treated or whatever. How do we re-engage? Well, I think the first thing that you've got to do, you can't bring back in a child who's been traumatized into a community that still doesn't understand, because they're just going to get re-traumatized. So I think you have to go down the journey of education and understanding, and only then, I think, can you start to ask the question that sort of says, well, how many people have you got in your church who might be autistic, or perhaps better, think differently or whatever? And then ask the question, and what about people who used to be in your church? And so I think we've got a long journey to make there. I don't think there's a quick leap to go rescue those children. What I would say is that there is a lot of information. I did a literature survey. Nearly all of the literature that's produced in the church context was aimed at either children or parents of children, and insofar as it addressed cognitive issues, it really addressed learning difficulties rather than different thinking. So there is material out there. I'm not sure. I think the church has to make the advance. And it has to advance from a position where mostly it doesn't currently understand, and you have to deal with it from that end. And then I think anything that we can do, in the kind of spaces that we operate in, that provide a sort of sanctuary for people who have been knocked about or mentally or kind of emotionally. Then I think we might have to find some channels outside the church to get a dialogue going, because I think that's the key to it, isn't it? I don't think there's a sort of solution that I can just put in a bazooka and fire into the ether and solve it. I think it's got to be a dialogue. I don't know whether I've helped or just stated the completely obvious, really.
Thank you very much for that, Stuart. So it's clear that there's a task for the church to do there. Meanwhile, you also talk about a safe space for those people who have been bruised, harmed, traumatized by the church. I wonder whether the following question relates to that, and that is a long question. I'm going to read that to you. So, any tips on how we can support people to develop their spirituality? I'm talking with someone who has recently been diagnosed with ASD. He struggles to concentrate, and so reading the Bible is difficult, as is prayer. I'm aware that the church often models a very narrow and individualistic version of spirituality, but unsure how to direct him to something that would be meaningful for him. He also finds it very difficult that God is not concrete. You mentioned about the cognitive dissonance. He feels very let down by God because he doesn't see God doing the things that a loving God would do. Yet he desperately desires a vibrant relationship with him, but is struggling to connect with what feels like an impersonal God. I wonder if this fits with your findings about people with ASD viewing God more as a force. But again, how do I help?
Yeah, all of this makes perfect sense. So the typical presentation of God, you know, as being a person and so on, and then you expect God to sort of do things, and we talk about God having a plan and blah blah blah, all this sort of thing. But all of the time you've got that logic, that systemic brain underneath that sort of says, I need to fit this into, and this is let's just be very clear here. This is a neurological thing. So this is not about how we have learned to think. This is not an attitude problem or anything like that. So as in with my laptop here, I'm currently looking at pictures and I'm typing words, but when you get down to the core engineering, this thing is working on zeros and ones. And if you put anything other than 0 or 1 in, it just won't do anything, just ignores it. So we're talking about a brain that works on the basis that this has to fit in a system. And so you see all the contradictions of what should happen, what doesn't happen. That passage doesn't agree with this passage. It's very hard work reading the Bible. So the first thing I think is to relax about it and say, well, actually, that's pretty much what you would expect. That makes sense. That's okay. And I think to find those voices that say, that's okay. Secondly, I think to ask the question, how do I process information? So I'm an auditory processor. I remember things that people say. I find reading hard work. I can do it. I'm quite dyslexic as well. So I find it more interesting, for example, to watch a talk on YouTube than try to read lots of things. Now, I mean, yes, reading the Bible is good, and you know, it's good to do that and so on and so forth. So it might be that having a sort of Bible, because you can get a Bible that talks at you if somebody's reading it, you know, a talking book kind of thing. So I think just thinking about how do you function, and if you function in an auditory way, that's fine. If you function in a very visual way, then you know, perhaps watching things on YouTube might be helpful. Can you just remind me what some of the question is about? So part of it was about difficulty with reading.
It was also the relational God or the impersonal God, rather.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I got that. So I think not to be put off by going down the route of an impersonal God. So one of my participants in my research sort of said, well, I was always quite troubled by the notion that my prayers were much shorter than anybody else's. But then I realized, hey, my conversations with other people are usually much shorter than everybody else's as well. And so I can understand that the idea of a sort of non-personal God is a bit weird. we are encouraged because of the incarnation of Christ into this, relational space. But I think it's okay to go there as long as you don't reckon that that is an explanation of everything. Does that make sense? That, you can think about Christ was a person, could relate to me, and so on and so forth. But the way, Jesus isn't just a bloke managing the universe, you can't just go straight from Jesus to kind of here's how the universe should work, because I don't think that works. And I think also for me, and maybe I'll just be kind of shut down as being a heretic here, it helped me to understand what it was I was reading when I was reading the Bible. So, for example, a friend of mine who's professor at Durham, I was talking to him about John's Gospel, and I said, did Jesus really say these things? I'm not really sure he did. And he said, well, he couldn't have done. He said, no, not really, because most of them are puns on Greek words. Jesus wasn't speaking Greek. So, so I think just to kind of get some understanding without, tripping over being a heretic or whatever, what is the Bible when I read it anyway? To be very kind of intellectual about this, so the whole kind of philosophical tradition of deconstruction, I went through a process where everything fell apart for me, just slowly but surely. A chimney fell off here and a door fell off there, and and so on and so forth, and that was very painful. And so I deconstructed my whole faith, and then I went through several years of just sort of being at the bottom of that, and then slowly begin to sort of put things together. So, oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. So what I've got now is something that is a construction. Now, what I had before was a construction, but I thought it was the real thing. At least now I know this is a construction. This is what I do to help me get by. It's a construction. I don't have to have everybody else doing it. And in 10 years' time, I might chuck it in the bin and do something else. And I think just to go through a process that says, I will work out a way that works for me. And that's okay, because the notion that everybody else has got the real thing is bogus anyway. We're all just making up something that works for us. I mean, the Trinity is just, how do we make some sort of sense out of something that we can't make any sense out of? And people use all kinds of words. We talk about the Bible is the word of God. Well, I heard Walter Brueggemann in a talk once, and he said, I was in a group, home group, if you like, and a woman said to me, well, Dr. Brueggemann, do you believe the Bible is the word of God? And he said, well, yes. And he said, oh, fine, carry on. And all his audience sort of said, oh, hang on a minute, she didn't know what she meant by that. And he said, well, no, of course she didn't. He said, but then neither did I. So, and we use these phrases, the kingdom of God, the Bible is the word of God, Jesus was the son of God. Do we know what they mean? No, not really. I'll leave it at there. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, but yeah, I'm disqualifying myself for any further engagement with this group.
Well, we'll do a kind of heresy evaluation afterwards, and edit out anything that we think is not appropriate. No, just kidding here. Okay. No, thank you very much. And I appreciate the way in which you try to create space for people and say it's okay. And I think that's really, really important. And
the big message that they've got all the time. And it's not necessarily what people are trying to tell them, but it's because they will take things literally. That's what they will read. Yeah. And so a bit like me, give to everybody that asks of you. Okay, right, off I go, and yeah. So, we just need to be aware that we might be reading more into what's being offered to us than is being offered to us, really.
Thanks a lot, Stewart. Staying a little bit broadly with the things that we have been talking about so far, here's another question or comment. As an Orthodox priest in the Coptic Orthodox Church, I find a resonance with many of the things you said about prayer and the spiritual life. We do teach a distinction between the image of God, which is inherent in each uniquely created person, and the likeness of Christ, which is the goal of each human person in becoming who they have been created to be in union with God. Likewise, prayer is understood not so much as talking to God, but entering into union with God and participating in a divine life. Do you think that there are traditional understandings of prayer and spirituality which are not Western and which might have more usefulness and fruitfulness for autistic Christians?
Brilliant. Yes, and yeah, and I think some of the Orthodox traditions, some of the Celtic traditions, more mystical traditions, and so this was one of the questions I asked in my book. Okay, so this is what autistic Christians think. Now, is that a defensible position theologically, or is it, or should we just be kind of told, no, that's not it? You know, you got it all wrong. And actually now, and I've not had a lot of time to research into this, but just I give some pointers in my books, but some of the sort of more mystical traditions, albeit sometimes, obviously not in the case of Orthodox, but some of them got sort of more marginalized on the fringes of the church. But some of those traditions, yes, contain a lot that's quite helpful. I mean, all of the sort of iconography, for example, in the Orthodox tradition. Now, you know, the Western sort of Protestant Reformation kind of, we don't like, making an image of God, go and get rid of all of those and so on and so forth. But, if you are a very visual thinker, some of those things might be really helpful. I haven't done a lot of research into it, but I can affirm that is a great question, and the answer to it is yes. Potentially there are traditions where I think there are things that are useful, and and these things have been around for years. Autistic people have been around for years, and so those sort of things have been developed, but not always mainstream church.
Yeah, thanks for that, Stewart. So here's another comment and question. Excellent session, thanks. Any examples of churches that have good practice in public services? Are there any good resources for Christian parents? And finally, I think these are 3 questions. So finally, are there any good examples for those who have also a learning disability, including nonverbal?
Right. And so that's great. So what I would suggest here, Liam, if you make available the link to the website, the Church for Everyone website.
Yes.
What I've endeavored to do on that website, so this is the community that I'm working through with a church in Didsbury. Now, some of you who I don't know how international folks are on the call here, but those of you in the UK might remember some years ago an Anglican church going through quite a difficult period when a teenage girl who was frightened of coming out gay committed suicide, and this resulted in the church going through quite a journey on what was referred to as inclusion, and so it's had quite an effect on the church, not just in the whole sort of gay space and LGBT and so on, but in other spaces as well. And so I've been invited, why don't you start a community to support autistic people? So as part of that, then we have a website, and on the website, I've tried to give some pointers of other resources that are available. And in my book, as an appendix, I list all of the materials that I looked at that were mainly aimed at children. Some of them were American, some British, that were available in the church space to help. And a lot of them for the children were more about learning difficulties, if I'm perfectly honest, rather than autism as such, which is fine, if that's what you're looking for. So So my book has an appendix with that information. I can't remember whether that same information is on the website, but there's quite a bit of stuff there. So yeah, get a copy of my book. Plug.
And rightly so, Stuart. That's a good plug. So that answers that question. It also answers the question, I think, later in the chat. Do you have any suggestions, recommended resources for how to best include autistic children and young people at church, both in terms of teaching and discipleship and in terms of fellowship? Do you want to add anything to what you just said in response to this, or do you think this?
Not hugely, Leon. The whole area of children is not an area that I'm particularly informed on. The materials that I've just referred to are worth a look. There's quite a lot of material there. I would go back to the first answer that I gave, that all of this is of no use whatsoever if the church doesn't understand what they're dealing with. So in the course of my research, I'll just give you this little anecdote. In the course of my research, I went to a meeting where a church leader from America is bringing his program on autism, wants to launch it in the UK. So he's got a son who's autistic. He's developed, mega church stuff. He's developed a program for autistic people, thinks it's great, wants to launch it in the UK. So this session was hosted by a Christian radio program and compared by a well-known evangelical leader and then this leader. I turned up half an hour early, which is what I usually do. Being autistic, I'm desperately worried about being late. So I'm the first person there. It's a 2-hour seminar, 11 to 1. So they said, "Oh, have you come for our leadership day?" So I'm thinking, "Oh, I don't know. I thought I'd come for a 2-hour seminar on how to make your church autism friendly." So eventually it transpired I'm in the right place. So I go in, big auditorium. I think, right, I'm going to sit over here. It's completely empty at this point. Lots of space. Eventually it fills up. 11 o'clock, nothing happened. 11:15, nothing happened. 11:20, guy gets up the front, says, "Right, let's get started. I want everybody to move into the center, close up right together because it's all going to be filmed," and so on and so forth. So the next thing he said was, "Right, can you all just sort of turn to people around you, greet them, say hi, tell them where you're from," and so on and so forth. And then they started the meeting and said, "Well, this is what we're doing this morning, and this afternoon, this is what we're doing and doing this." I'm thinking, how am I going to get out of here? I've got to get home, and so on and so forth. And in the end, I wrote to the guy that was convening this thing, that was comparing it, and I said this was the least autism-friendly event that I've been to in many years, and I'm a trustee at the National Autistic Society. And what's more, what this guy was saying, I think he needs to talk to somebody like the NAS, because if he comes from America and starts saying this stuff, it's going to go down like a lead balloon. But the point I was making was the whole event was non-autistic friendly, and yet it was about autism and how to make your church autism friendly. And so, if you're going to bring people into an atmosphere where they just can't breathe, it doesn't matter what you're going to do. So I go back to that answer. But yeah, have a look at the materials in the appendix on the website. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Stuart. And the website, I see that Hannah has posted the link to the website in the chat box.
Oh, brilliant. Okay.
And I can just underline what you just said about your own book. Just buy it, people. Just buy it. So going back to what you just said, and the example of your church, thinking again about what it means to be a community, Stuart. Here's a question. Hi, Stuart. Wonderful talk. Very much looking forward to reading your book. Do you think there is space to create new worshiping communities specifically for autistic people, or should all effort go into improving existing churches, or should we do both?
Right. I don't think there is a rule or an answer here. What I would say, and I've included this probably more in the training materials that I've written down in the book. The knee-jerk response to any situation in the church, we need to do this. Okay, let's have a meeting. And so autistic people don't necessarily like meetings that much. And so what I've tried to do with the community that I'm building is to try and make it so that you don't have to be in a meeting to feel part of it and join in. Now, having said that, we meet once a month on a Saturday for an hour, and we have a sort of workshop and whatever. So, but these are people who are all over the UK. So Grant quite often comes. There's a Catholic priest down in Taunton. There's people in London. An activist for the NAS. And all over the country. So some here in Manchester. So, I'm not really a great fan of let's set up a community, let's do this, and so on and so forth. I think these things happen fairly organically, and you build around people, and it would be very nice, I think, if they operated within existing churches, because one of the things that I think is important is, especially in the context of the NAS in UK, we are facing constantly the downward pressure on available money to provide services for autistic people. And so there's always a limit on what you can do because of what the state will fund. But don't you think that faith communities generally, and not just the church, but I think it's an interesting question for other faith communities as well, but don't you think faith communities ought to be a great, safe place for autistic people to belong and grow and flourish?
Okay, and a related question maybe, or at least it's related, I think. Interesting that you talk about the need for a go-to person. One of the recommendations of the recent review of the Scottish Strategy for Autism is the need for an autism commissioner who would be the national go-to person. So do you think this need is a general one and not just confined to church life?
Yeah, quite probably. And in my training material, I talk about I've got on this website, I've got 8 training modules, and 6 of them, 5 of them, one's an intro, 5 of them are sort of practical things, like how do I work out who in my congregation might be autistic or needs help, what are the issues they're going to struggle with, and so on and so forth. And I've completely lost the thread of go-to person. Yeah, so what I've said is, in terms of putting a training program together or whatever, I think you need to look at 3 levels. So there's the general level that the congregation need to have a general level of awareness and understanding so that they can have a dialogue. They don't just put their foot in it. They don't, and so on and so forth. They can have the right conversations and welcome people. Secondly, you've then got the leaders and the people who are trying to do something, organize the group or, whatever. They need to understand things in a bit more depth, but they don't need to be experts on autism, but they need to understand what autistic people are likely to struggle with and so on, so they don't set things up that don't work for autistic people and so on. And then you've got a third level, the sort of expert level, where you don't need many of them, the sort of go-to person. And so I spent many years, and I had a pet question, and you may think it's theologically insignificant and you can answer it in a flash, Liam, I don't know, but I was really struggling with the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew and Luke, which are different. They seem to contradict each other. You can't really put them together. Luke claims that all his stuff is kind of well researched and carefully looked into and so on. And not only that, but in Luke, at one end you've got Adam, at the other end you've got Jesus. Now, you either go down the route that Adam is literally a person and Jesus was literally a person, or one was mythical. So whichever way you juggle the mythical and actual, you end up with quite a complicated problem any which way around. Now, I couldn't get anybody to take this question seriously, including my professor friend in Durham for many years, as to why is that a problem? I'm very interesting, move on. And yet this is keeping me awake at night, okay? And it's troubling me. And because it's I guess it's symptomatic of something that sort of says this thing doesn't fit together, you know, this is all just falling apart and so on and so forth. So I think there is a need for somebody to be able to get past the question that says, but we all have that question. Why is that different for autistic people? And that's what I try to get to in my book, because in my dissertation, my supervisor asked me that question. I've read your first draft, great, but we all have that. So I have the same problems. I'm not autistic. And you go, well, what is it that makes that a problem for autistic people, particularly, and so on and so forth. And it all has to do with this cognitive dissonance that won't let it go, and the obsessiveness that says, yes, I know, but this doesn't work, and it's worrying me, and now it's distressing me, and now it's causing me a nervous breakdown, and, you know, getting depressed and so on and so forth, because the whole of my faith is starting to decompose here.
Thanks for that. So, yeah, question here. What practical difference in your life did your diagnosis make?
Right. Great question, because I was 52, and there's very much a debate in the ether about diagnosis. So Simon Baron-Cohen, who I quoted in my talk, his view is that one should only go for a diagnosis if it is required as a passport, as it were, to get services from the state. And I think that's probably a reasonable view to take with children. I actually pursued my diagnosis. What difference did it make? I would say that what it did was it gave me permission to stand down on banging my head against a certain number of doors. Say that's never going to work. Now I understand why this is not working. It's never likely to work. Stop banging your head on it. On the one hand, and look, but there's this other door over here. If that's the way your brain is working, why not try this? And so I think it enabled me to have a conversation, for example, with my wife. This is what's happening at work. I could see, you know, once I understand what's happening, you know, because otherwise she would just say, oh, just do this, you know. Well, no, I can't do that, you know. And so now I understand why I can't do that. Let's try and find some things that I can do, and so on and so forth. So handling the politics was an absolute classic. But and I never would be able to. So a career in diplomacy was never a possibility, really. But what I could do is I could learn to see the brick wall coming before I got there, figure out the fact that I'm going to hit a brick wall, figure out that this is to do with the way I'm thinking. It's not just because they're being stupid. Therefore, I'd better stop and do something different and get some help or some advice or whatever, and I can navigate my way around the wall to some extent. So I think it's that sense of liberty, of giving me the freedom. I like understanding these things. If all it is a millstone around your neck, you don't want a label that somebody just, I mean, when I was 20, you know, I didn't particularly want a label that said autistic. I mean, not that it was an issue when I was 20, I didn't know anything about it, but I can understand why you may or may not be happy to have a label at that point. Now I'm 67, I don't really care.
Right, thank you very much, Stewart, for your personal answer to a personal question. There are two comments by the same person here in the chat box that I'm just going to read to you. Hi, I'm 55, recently diagnosed, member of a traditional liturgical church. My favorite time at church is during a liturgy with a small congregation or hiding in the sanctuary. I never liked being in big meetings or listening to what seemed to me personal slants homilies. Two things. As a woman, although I relate to some of what you said, I think women may have a slightly different outlook. Two, my son, who is not and won't be diagnosed, is showing signs of not really wanting to join the groups. I fully understand where he's coming from. I do not attempt to push him into it either. I try and pass on the spirituality without dragging him into the community. And then the second comment by the same person, she says, I'm also interested in the abstract spirit versus being conceptualization of God. Is there any or much evidence for some autistic people moving between these ways of thinking and ideally explaining this movement to themselves and researchers, for example, with reference to context? That was a mouthful.
That was a very long question. Yeah. So, so in terms of relating to the small, more liturgical service and so on and so forth, I think that makes great sense. So one of the services in the church that I go to, 9 o'clock on a Sunday, it's a very short service, a small number of people go, and it's very much kind of prayer book liturgy, very structured. So there are lots of things that are plus points for autistic people in that space. Where the wheels really started to come off for me in the church context. So yeah, standing around at coffee after church was always a problem. So I used to just stand around like a lemon waiting for my wife to finish talking to people, and we could go home, you know. So, but whilst I was in the service, fine. But when things in the service started to crumble, I really was in trouble. So I've been along to that 9 o'clock service, and what I find is that the way the liturgy works, and this is, remember I said, you know, focusing on what the words say and what they mean and so on and so forth, that it was almost a 1 hour diatribe about me being worthless, being a sinner, needing God's mercy, not being worthy to pick up the crumbs under the table, you know, bewailing my manifold sins and, you know, so on and so forth. You know, kind of think, well, is this what I really need? You know, an hour on Sunday to be kind of just kind of bashed over the head with this all the time. So I think I can relate to the small service and liturgy. Interestingly, some of my research participants didn't like things like liturgies and so on because they just found them sort of very boring and repetitive and so on and so forth. But there are quite a few that found comfort in the sameness of it. And it seems to me that's perfectly okay. And I think, you know, as one gets older, one is quite more able to sort of say, yes, I'll do that. That works for me. Thank you very much. No, I'm not doing it. I'm not. No, right. This church barbecue. No, not for me. Thanks. In terms of wanting, you know, how to deal with the kids, obviously, you know, talking to somebody in the 50s, the kids are getting a bit older. I've got two sons, one of whom is 33, and is a pillar of the church in Sheffield. You know, so if ever I go there, there's all kinds of arm waving, and you know, he's fully into it. So fine. So not autistic in the slightest. Takes after his mother. My other son is diagnosed on the spectrum. Interestingly, was quite interested in going to an alpha course run by a big church in London. The first half of this was sitting in a pub and answering and discussing fairly general questions about life and philosophy and what you think about things. He thought it was great. Halfway through the alpha course, they start to turn the pressure up and they say, well, we're going to hold the meetings in our church, and then we'd like you to go away for this weekend with us. And at that point, I'm out, gone. He is, I would describe him as a spiritual person, a thinking person, a thoughtful person, but he doesn't want anything to do with the church or Christianity as such because of the baggage and the labels and the connotations that he sees going with it. Now, I am of a view at my great age and my philosophical and theological persuasion where I'm not sure that Jesus is terribly interested whether you go to church or not. You know, I wouldn't try to push him into going to a church, or but I do think that it's helpful to keep the door open, because if you try to kind of push these things or manipulate them, what you end up doing is shutting down the dialogue. And it's a bit like the Walter Brueggemann thing about, is the Bible the word of God? And the way he explained that was, if I said no, this woman would just shut down on me, and I've lost the conversation. That's it, it's gone. If I say yes, even though neither of us really know what that's about, then I can keep having the conversation. And I think it's about finding ways to keep having the conversation. Yeah, so and that's the route I've taken with my younger son, who's just turned 30. I think in many ways he's very, very Christian and very spiritual. And you know, his view, having been diagnosed when he was 12, is, oh, surely I've grown out of it now. So you know, he's not interested in calling himself autistic or whatever. But when he kind of smashed, he's a saxophone player, when he smashed up both his elbows, doing something completely daft, trying to ride a bike down a mountain in Switzerland and too fast, came off and smashed his elbows up the day before he's supposed to go on stage playing the saxophone. And he was out of commission for 6 months, which when you can't earn any money, that's a problem. So but he occasionally does these things where he just goes straight past a boundary that everybody else would recognize, and he just doesn't notice it, doesn't take any awareness of it. Now, I'm not sure it's that helpful to go to him and sort of say, this is all to do with being autistic or whatever. I think it's much more helpful just to talk to him about, you know, what he's doing and why it is and what we can do about it. And at some point, if the word autism comes up, well, that's fine. But it's got so many connotations, Leon, at the moment, because historically, all of the diagnostic criteria come out of documents called the International Compilation of Diseases, or the Directory of Statistics on Mental Disorders. And you can think, well, I don't really want to think of myself as having a disease or being mentally disordered. So that's a very long answer to a straightforward question.
That's
quite a long question.
That's great. Can you give a brief answer, because time is almost up, but can you give just a 1-minute answer to a more complicated question maybe? And that was the second part here. Also interested in the abstract spirit versus being conceptualization of God. Right. Is there any evidence for some autistic people moving between these ways of thinking?
Well, I think, there is. This is where the functional MRI research started to kind of pick up this question. And some of the researchers initially said, oh, that's because autistic people aren't religious. And then other more nuanced researchers came along and said, well, maybe they're just thinking differently about it. So I'm not sure there is. That's why I wrote my book. I don't think there is a lot of writing in this space on this topic. Having said that, I did try to at least touch the question that sort of says, is this a valid place to be theologically? So you will see that I've got some reference to Karl Barth in my book, and Paul Tillich, just to, as it were, give some credence to this way of thinking that you know, it is a well-established theological tradition. And so what I got, if you remember that diagram with all the bars on, the churches were sat in the middle. So it's not a case of, you know, the churches are just down the personal view of God end. The church has a tradition of God being, you know, the cloud of unknowing and the mystery and so on and so forth. And so you read some of the sort of mystical writing, you know, kind of the church fathers, and that's what you find. So I'm not sure, Leon, to what extent I've answered any of these people's questions. I hope that's been of some use. My email address is on the Church for Everyone websites, people are quite welcome to contact me, and I guess presumably also through your centre.
That's for sure. Stewart, thank you so much for dealing with all those questions. Whether you've answered every question satisfactorily, I don't know. I was only the moderator, only the reader of the questions, but I think you've done a great job. I've really enjoyed this session and learning from your wisdom and learning from your perspective as an autistic author and autistic Christian in church. I think this was really, really helpful, and I feel there was a lot in this session that needs further unpacking. So I really encourage everyone to buy the book, read more about what Stewart has to say here. And I'm sure this is not the last time that we've heard from each other. Stewart, certainly in the centre, of course, but also others might come across you at other events. Do look up the website, people, the churchforeveryone.info. And Stewart, yeah, just thank you so much. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Leon. Thank you for the invitation. And these questions don't have yes/no answers, do they? So, you know, they are for exploring rather than answering us in a way.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just one final word here for everyone. If you want to keep up to date with the activities of the Centre for Autism and Theology, do subscribe to our mailing list just by sending me an email, the same email address that you found on the invitation to the webinar, cat@abdn.ac.uk. And as of last week, we have a Facebook page. So just why don't you give us a like, follow us on Facebook, all of that. But for now, I wish you a very good remainder of your day. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.